When the dogs howl, someone must die. The howling. You should not be reading this. No one should. But if you insist, then know that you're inviting something into your life. A presence that will never leave. You're not alone anymore. Before we begin, if you're reading this in the dark, in silence, or worse, alone, I have to warn you, stop. Stop reading. Click away or else you might not make it out of this. You've been warned. Now let's continue because it's too late for you to turn back now. It started in a small, forgotten town. The kind of place where people never leave, where time seems to have died long ago. The houses stood like tombstones, each one holding its own secret. And in the dead of night, the dogs would howl. You see, there was a rule in that town, one that everyone feared to speak of, for it was the one thing they could never break. When the dogs howled at night, someone had to die. It wasn't the sound of barking that made the villagers' skin crawl. No, that was normal, dogs howling at the moon, echoing through the trees. It was the pattern of the howling that sent tremors through the townsfolk, gnawing at their bones, locking their bodies in place with an unnatural fear. The howling wasn't random. It was specific, precise. The howls came in intervals. 3 long howls, then silence. 3 short howls, then silence again. And then, the silence would remain for far too long. In that silence, the people would hold their breath. The rule had been set for generations, passed down by whispers in the dark. It was a curse. An ancient curse. If the dogs howled after midnight, someone would die. That was the price. The silence meant they were too late. The entity had already chosen. The townsfolk had learned to live with this fear, to pretend it wasn't there, to lock their doors tight, praying that they wouldn't be the next victim. For those who were chosen didn't die instantly. No, it was worse. They would be taken, vanished, snatched away in the middle of the night, their screams swallowed by the forest. The worst part? No one knew who it would be. The howls weren't a warning, they were a signal. A signal that the clock was ticking and someone's time had come. But one night something changed. A stranger wandered into town, lost, desperate for shelter. His name was Thomas, a traveler who had heard whispers of the town's strange fate but didn't believe in such superstitions. The locals warned him to leave, but he didn't listen. He was too tired, too naive. He took refuge in the inn, unaware that the clock had already started ticking. The dogs had begun their howling, sending a chill through the air. But this time the howls weren't right. The pattern was broken, jagged. An unnatural rhythm filled the night. The town was on edge. The dogs had never sounded this desperate, this wrong. Thomas lay in his bed trying to ignore the sounds. But the howling wouldn't stop. It got louder, closer, until he could feel the vibration beneath his skin. The walls of the inn began to pulse with the rhythm of the howls. And then, at once, there was silence. A thick, suffocating silence. He knew instinctively that the curse had been invoked. Someone would die tonight. But who? The door to his room creaked open and Thomas froze. He could feel something unseen, something not human, staring at him from the doorway. A figure stood there, its shape warped by the darkness. Eyes gleamed hollow black. It stepped forward, its breath heavy with a cold that cut through Thomas's flesh like a knife. "Who are you?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. But the figure didn't respond. It didn't need to. It was never meant to. The dogs howled again, but now they sounded satisfied. The curse had been fulfilled. Thomas didn't know it yet, but he was already a part of this town's twisted fate. And his name was already whispered in the shadows, waiting for the inevitable. The figure moved closer. Its eyes never left him. And then, darkness. The dogs are howling again. Do you hear them? That's not a sound you should ignore. The town is waiting. The curse is always waiting. You can feel it now, can't you? The presence that watches you. The weight of what you've just heard. And now there's no going back. You've invited it. You've listened and now it knows your name. Do you dare to continue? Or do you turn away while there's still time? Don't say I didn't warn you. Subscribe to my channel and let's see how deep the nightmare goes. Not yet, but you're not going to like what comes next. If you've made it this far, then brace yourself. The true horror is only just beginning. The curse awakened. You feel it, don't you? That tightening in your chest. The whispering in the back of your mind, telling you that the story is far from over. That presence you thought you could ignore, it's closer now, isn't it? You think you can escape, but the nightmare is alive inside you, feeding on your fear, waiting to consume you whole. Remember Thomas? You won't forget him. He's still here, somewhere, trapped in the same fate that binds this cursed town. His screams are distant now, swallowed by the deep, suffocating woods that stretch endlessly beyond the village's borders. But his soul is still tethered to the place where the dogs howl, to the curse that never dies. They say that when the dogs howl, it's not just a signal, it's an invitation. An invitation for death. For the entity that haunts the woods, waiting for its next victim. And you're next. You should have stopped reading, but it's too late for that now. The town was silent for days after Thomas disappeared. The locals went about their lives as though nothing had happened. But there was something off. A lingering dread that hung in the air like a thick fog. You could feel it, couldn't you? Something was wrong. The dogs hadn't howled again since that night. Not until now. A knock on the door. It was strange. Thomas had gone missing days ago, and yet there it was again, the sound. A knock. Soft, deliberate. And then the scratching began. Long, slow strokes that sent shivers down the spine, scraping across the wood, each one louder than the last. A door opened slowly. But what stood there wasn't a person. It was something far worse. It was the same figure that had visited Thomas, but now its face was different. Distorted, stretched like a mask that had been pulled too tight. Its eyes were still hollow, black as night, but they glinted with something else. Hunger. Please? The voice wasn't its own. It was Thomas's voice, hollow and distorted, just like the figure that stood before him. Please help me. But there was nothing to help. It wasn't Thomas anymore. Not really. The curse had claimed him, twisted him into something else, something far worse than death. And as the figure stepped closer, something in the air shifted. The shadows in the room seemed to move, to stretch, as if the darkness itself was alive, reaching for him, pulling him toward the void. The dogs outside began to howl again, but this time it wasn't just the dogs. There were other sounds, low, guttural growls, screeches, and whispers that seemed to crawl beneath the skin, urging him to join them, to give in. The figure reached out with cold, skeletal hands, and Thomas, now nothing more than a vessel for the curse, grabbed him. The grip was like ice, pulling him into the darkness. There was no escape. No one ever spoke of what happened next. The townspeople didn't even acknowledge the scream that echoed through the night, as if the curse itself had stolen the very sound of fear. You're not alone, are you? Can you hear it? The dogs howling once more. Closer this time. Louder. The curse is awake and it knows you're here. Now that you've heard the tale, now that you've invited it into your life, the nightmare doesn't end with the story. It follows you. It watches, lurking in the shadows, waiting. It's too late to turn away, because you listened. And as the dogs howl once more, somewhere, deep in the darkness, the entity smiles. It knows your name now. Subscribe. Stay close. Because when the dogs howl again, it will be your turn. The nightmare doesn't end. It just begins again.